Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Iowa Community of Practice. My name is Jessica Craho. I'm a member of the Iowa Coalition for Integration and Employment, project coordinator, and also a member of the Employment First leadership team for Iowa. We are embarking on and kicking off our 9th year, believe it or not, with the Iowa Community of Practice, which we began back in 2014. And that was a collaboration between Employment First, an ODEP effort right here in the state, and the Iowa Coalition for Integration and Employment, part of the PI project or PI grant. And that collaborative effort remains as such. So we want to thank the DD Council and IVRS for their continued investment and support and collaboration to offer the community of practice to employment professionals statewide.
Community of practice meeting.
The live captioning is available thanks to the Center for Inclusive Design and Innovation at the Georgia Institute of Technology and the College of Design. So thank you to Heather, who's our lead captioner and our captioner for today. If you need that link can be found in the chat to that stream text. Okay, so just check that there in the chat. Today's session is being recorded and it'll be shared back to the mailing list along with the presentation and any additional materials. If you are not a member of the mailing list and would like to be, please just give me an email, Jess Craho, and I'll be sure to share that in the chat. Be sure to remain muted so that we ensure quality and to share your questions and comments in the chat as you have them, but we'll open the mics as our presenter dictates. So I think without further ado, I can't really think of a better way to begin our year than with Dr. Joseph Jones, the Executive Director of the Harkin Institute. As you may know, the Harkin Institute works tirelessly to improve the lives of all Americans by giving policymakers access to high quality information and engaging citizens as active participants in the formation of public policy. And most recently, this is really exciting, completed the Tom and Ruth Harkin Center, the most accessible building in the country. In his free time, Dr. Jones is an adjunct at Drake University here in Des Moines, as a councilman for Windsor Heights City Council and chairs numerous boards. He's going to discuss with us an incredibly timely and critical topic, I think, of ableism in society and the evolution of disability policy here in the United States. We're going to talk about public policy, perception, pivotal court rulings, the ADA and its amendments, right? And kind of draw that to present day. So as you listen to Dr. Jones today, I want you to remember that the Department of Justice just completed their investigation into Iowa's resource centers, Glenwood and Woodward, and the larger service system that serves those with disabilities, particularly those with intellectual disabilities, and found that we are in fact as a state in violation of Title II of the ADA, which says that public entities must administer services, programs, and activities in the most integrated setting appropriate to the needs of qualified individuals with disabilities, and that we are relying heavily on institutional settings. So please have that lens today as you listen to Dr. Jones and be thinking kind of critically about our own service system and how we're doing things here in Iowa. So Dr. Jones, take it away. Thank you so much.
Hi, and good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you a little bit and talk to you a little bit about this subject matter and hopefully have a good discussion with you. I realized as I was getting ready for this that I have made this sort of presentation several different times, and I've created several different types of presentations to go along with it. So I think what you're going to see is the one that I like the best, but some of them are much longer than this one. And I think I want to be able to have conversation with you and not lecture with you. So I appreciate your indulgence here. So I'm going to share my screen. And great. Just can you see my screen? Excellent. Great. So as just said, my name is Joseph Jones. I'm the Executive Director of the Harkin Institute for Public Policy and Citizen Engagement, and we're based here at Drake University. And the program we're going to have today is going to talk a little bit about the history of disability policy and ableism and some of the laws that I see as kind of the important things to remember and know in this history. 1 second here. So, as many of you know, Tom Harkin was born in Cumming, Iowa. And I don't start a presentation about our work without talking about the person behind the name. And Tom grew up in Cumming. He went to school here in Des Moines, where I am, and then went to Iowa State for his undergrad, and then off to join the Navy before embarking on a career in other public service after he left active duty and was in the Navy Reserves. But that house where he was born in Cumming, still there. He still lives there. He was literally born in that house. And so it's a very special place to he and his family. So the Harkin Institute started with what we call the Harkin Collection, and it exists in the archives at Drake. The archives is a collection of many different papers, but the Harkin Collection being the preponderance of them. So when I was on his staff in DC, we packed up 800 boxes of documents and put them on the back of a semi and shipped it back to Iowa in January of 2015, along with 2.5 terabytes of electronic data and then our very iconic popcorn machine. So if you ever visited our Washington, DC office, we made popcorn there all day, every day. And that machine now exists here at the Harkin Center in Des Moines on Drake's campus. And in addition to the collection, we have several other papers there that kind of round out Iowa's involvement in public policy. And I'll just briefly mention that. So Neil Smith, Terry Branstad, Bob Ray, Wayne Ford, the Caucus Collection, and we're continuing to bring more papers to the archives here at Drake so we can better safeguard all of the ways that Iowans have impacted public policy across the nation and around the world. The Institute itself focuses on 4 policy areas, and as was alluded to before, disability is one of the ones that comes to mind most often when people talk about Tom and Ruth Harkin. The second is wellness and nutrition, and the third, labor and employment, and last is retirement security. And I won't go into much detail, but each one of these has its own director, its own advisory committee of experts from across the country and around the world who work in that policy area. And each one is developing their own signature events and activities that we do annually in that space. And so the next one that's coming up will be in retirement security in early March. And then we'll do our wellness and nutrition symposium will be at the end of March. And then our disability summit is focused on employment. So we do that one every year. And then the next one being abroad in Belfast in Northern Ireland in June. So how do we get to disability? As many of you know, Senator Harkin's brother Frank lost his hearing at a very early age. And Frank was sent to school at what was then called the Iowa School for Deaf and Dumb. And the senator always felt like his brother could have done more than what his options were once he graduated from school. And his options were limited, so he took a job as a baker. But over time was able to find better employment, more meaningful employment, and something that he liked to do. But that wasn't always the case for everyone with a disability, as you all know. And so he thought that if he ever had the opportunity to affect change and to have some input into how disability is viewed in our country, then he would do his best to do so for his brother Frank and other people like their family. And so that was the origin of much of his disability work. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about kind of the paradigms of how we've looked at things in our country, and I can go into this later, but this always reminds me of the work that we do at the Institute in other parts of the world, because depending on where we go, they might be lagging behind us by several decades, right? And so when I talk about old paradigms in the medical model and the need to fix and people being defective, those are the words that were used then. And I see that being the same thing that is introduced in conversations when I'm abroad, I realize that knowing this history is really important to meeting those folks where they are and trying to pull them along to where we all want to go when we talk about disability. And we know that people with disabilities face a huge array of barriers and segregation, isolation, exclusion, all based on this idea that folks either need to be isolated or they need to be fixed. There was a perfect or better way of living, and people with disabilities needed to be adapted to do that. And that was the way of thinking. We like to think of it as a natural and normal part of the human experience. It's the only minority group anyone can join at any time, as people say quite often. It's focusing on taking meaningful action with the person and not to fix the person. And then eliminating some of the barriers that exist that keep people with disabilities from fully participating in society. And so we try to break these down into 3 different areas. First, there's attitudinal barriers. And so this is, what you run into with non-disabled people and their beliefs and their stereotyping of people with disabilities about what they can and can't do, what needs to be done for them, their ability to interact and engage at the same level as a non-disabled person. And then you have architectural barriers. And those are exactly what you're talking about, those physical things that get in the way of someone being able to fully participate, whether that be a step or a doorway or a non-accommodation at a workplace. All of those things are the physical barriers that get in the way. And then the third being the institutional barriers. And this is where we spend a lot of our time at the Institute, but the other 2 are strongly important to us as well. But these are the policies and practices, procedures and rules, all the things that are put into place that either directly or inadvertently become barriers to people with disabilities. So I mentioned earlier the medical model. And in the early years of how we looked at disability, this was the predominant model. It was the predominant conversation. And basically the idea is that the person had to be cured. And the professions around the people with disabilities were trying to get that person back to what they considered to be normal. And instead of seeing it as that spectrum, like I talked about, they saw it as a huge impairment of the body and something that meant that they were not culturally or socially fit to be with others. And so what can we do then to fix that person? And the role of the medical person was to cure the condition or reduce it to its most normal limits or within normal limits. So all of the methods and treatments that were thought of during that time period, during the, I would say, up until the late 1960s or so, became that sort of way of looking at disability. It was something to be fixed. And then we see ableism, and this is where some of those attitudinal barriers come in. And we define it as the individual and institutional oppression and discrimination against people with disabilities. It's really not, has not been well understood in the past. And I think a lot of entities out there, a lot of advocacy groups and civil rights groups and others have brought to the forefront what this has been in the past and what it looks like now. And I think more and more people are becoming aware of ableism. And when we think about it, it really just defines that person by their disability, and that's it. They are their disability. And that's the way that we have seen many of the laws and other policies that have come into place. Again, people putting their stereotype on what they believe a person can or can't do, or what they're able to achieve based on what their thought is on that particular disability, and not the human being themselves. And again, looking at ways to fix that person because they are in need of fixing, they're less than or other. So some of the cultural examples of this, obviously there's always these horrible conversations about eugenics and sterilization that occurred in the 20th century. We know that there's a calculated of at least 60,000 people who were considered feeble-minded in different governments' eyes who were sterilized. And there's a lot of, a few court cases that point to that. One of them is Buck v. Bell with Carrie Buck, who was sterilized against her will because the court saw that, or said that she was genetically unfit. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, Supreme Court Justice, Senator Harkin likes to quote this a lot because it's in his remarks. He said 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And that was his reasoning behind having her sterilized. And so, you know, the discrimination also extended to other things like what we called ugly laws at the time. And so there were laws in the books in major cities, I listed here, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, that spoke to people having undesirable traits, physical traits. And then it also talks about things like poverty and criminal behavior coming from some of those things, and justifying institutionalization of some of those individuals. Of course, we know about the separation of students from classrooms, and amniocentesis to detect Down syndrome is another way of looking at this, is looking for abnormalities. Not saying it's good or bad, but these are ways that we're seeing things being done. And we know that state and federal jails, prisons contain 3 times as many people with mental health conditions as mental health hospitals do. And so that speaks a little bit to how we address some things from a policy standpoint. The other thing that was really an interesting example of an ugly law is people who looked offensive. I don't know who got to judge whether or not someone looked offensive or not, weren't allowed on the street. And so they would get fined or jailed for being out. And that's a direct similarity to many of the things I've seen, particularly in some parts of Asia, where families are, you know, made to feel ashamed that they have someone with a disability in their family, and so that person does not go out in public. You don't see them on the street or at the store or in any of the markets. Now, there was a bit of a mindset shift after veterans started to return home, and we saw more people who had served our country have disabilities, and you know that began much of what we see as voc rehab and other things. And so I think that started to make people think a little bit differently about how they consider disability, and that continues to this day. I do like to use this slide as a way of talking about, and we use this a lot with employers as well. We go through a whole list of these things where ableism says, you know, you're choosing an inaccessible venue for a meeting or event and therefore excluding some participants. And of course, ableism can be both intentional and unintentional, but it's still ableism. And the opposite of that is ensuring all chosen venues are accessible and accommodating before you book, not as an afterthought. Assuming people must have a visible disability to actually be disabled. That's a very strong ableism trait, but you know, it's important that we understand that disability is not always visible. One of my British colleagues refers to it, instead of invisible disability, she refers to it as a non-apparent disability, which I thought was an interesting way that they like to describe it. And then person-first language is where we fall on the spectrum. I think that there's a resurgence of people with disabilities claiming the disability first, and I think that that is perfectly fine. I don't get to choose. I usually ask people what they prefer. But as a general rule for us in our writing, we'd use person-first language currently. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of that, the civil rights history that falls into place with our conversation about disability. And I am going under the assumption that many of you have heard of all of these, if not one or two. And the first being the Section 504 Rehabilitation Act. And it was passed pretty quietly. No one really recognizing that it was part of a larger bill. It prohibits the discrimination against people with disabilities and programs that receive federal funding or any sort of federal aid. And this was really the first disability civil rights law to be enacted. And it's based on the 1964 Civil Rights Act and basically swapping race for disability in that it transformed the environment and not just an individual protected class. But that was the result of many different things, to include the famous San Francisco sit-in that pushed the rules to actually be written to enact the law. Just as a aside, because I'm a nerd, when we pass legislation, it becomes the law, but how it actually gets enacted and enforced all comes through a rulemaking process that comes after a legislative body, in this case Congress, passes the law. So you need the agency that's actually responsible for the administration of that law to actually write rules and definitions and that sort of thing. And so that had not happened, and there was a big push to make that happen because Section 504 wasn't actually implemented until much later, and we'll talk about that in a second. The second here is IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which guaranteed all children with disabilities a free and appropriate public education. And then last but not least in this section, the ADA, which prohibited discrimination in employment, public services, public accommodations, and telecoms. So starting with Section 504, higher ed institutions had to provide educational auxiliary aids. So things that helped that person with a disability to be able to navigate the educational environment. So books and records on tape, braille items, talking calculators, it provided for VR programs, reasonable accommodation for the individuals, and then it assists statutes in providing, expanding, and improving the provision of independent living services. And that's just the first step. The second step is that it prohibits the exclusion of otherwise qualified people with disabilities in any federal program that receive federal assistance. So basically this made everyone pay attention because if they got federal money for any particular thing, they could not discriminate against someone with a disability, which then set up equal access to higher education because all of those institutions or many of those institutions were receiving federal funds for their operations and for many of their programs. And it says that it requires employers to make reasonable accommodations. And so making facilities accessible, restructuring jobs and modifying schedules, providing interpreters and readers. And remember, this is the Rehab Act of 1973. Section 504 was not implemented until 1977. So that's how long it took to get the rules written and get the processes into place. The federal government drug its feet from the executive branch standpoint in enacting this law. Later on, the act was amended and required federal agencies to use and maintain electronic information that provides individuals with disabilities access and to what is available to individuals without disabilities. It provided for choice throughout the VR process, and then directed VR agencies to assist schools in identifying transition services. So that was kind of this, and the next slide we'll talk about kind of after seeing implementation, there were a couple things to go back and make sure that we weren't missing, because they were a part of the spirit of the law, but not necessarily the letter of the law, and how the federal agencies that were in charge of enforcing the law were interpreting. And so you have to go back and correct. And we'll see that again with another piece of legislation coming up. It made folks receiving SSI and SSDI automatically eligible for VR. It created the reference of individuals with a significant disability, and then created state rehabilitation councils and expanded some of its membership. Then we go to IDEA, which actually started out as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. So there you go, more antiquated language, but it shows you, where we've come from. It was renamed IDEA in 1990, and it created the Office of Special Education Programs. Part B guarantees all children with disabilities free and appropriate public education. C looks at intervention services and individual family service plans, and D is transitional services. And then in that same time period is as IDEA became the new name and language for the legislation, was the final passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And several members of Congress had been working on this since the late 80s. And Tom Harkin reintroduced that bill in the Senate, which was going to extend those anti-discrimination protections, just like the Civil Rights Act. And the legislation was championed by he and Senator Bob Dole and Senator Ted Kennedy, who directed Senator Harkin to take that lead, and then of course ultimately was signed by President George H.W. Bush in July of 1990. There was another connection there in that the Amendments Act in 2008 were signed by Bush 43, his son, in 2008. So two Bush legacies with the disability community. So like I was talking about the Rehab Act, the ADA had a couple things that needed to go into conversation about how they were being implemented. And we wanted to make sure that there was going to be a way to get folks to do the thing that was intended when Congress passed the ADA. And so the ADA Amendments Act came to be in 2008. And it expanded the definition of disability. It says that impairments that are remissive or episodic are still disabilities if they are disabilities when they're active. The ADA and the listing of what some of the protections are should be viewed more broadly or interpreted more broadly than had been in the past. The Supreme Court had limited really much of the interpretation of what was in the ADA in many cases. And so the Amendments Act went on to spell out what they meant. So they could make broader protections for more individuals with disabilities across the country. And so that was championed by Orrin Hatch and Tom Harkin, and eventually then passed and signed by President George W. Bush in 2008. So I think we'll now move to discussion. I know I flew through a lot of that, but I want to be able to make sure that we had time to discuss. I didn't really talk too much about the 4 goals of the ADA, but it's equal opportunity, it's economic self-sufficiency, full participation, and independent living. And all of those things majorly important. Senator Harkin usually refers to the economic self-sufficiency, the 4th part of the goals, being the one that's the least realized today. The unemployment rate for people with disabilities is still about the same as it was in 1990. Many of the jobs that they're offered are menial jobs and not actual meaningful or career-oriented jobs. And so that's one of the reasons that we focus here at the Institute on employment for people with disabilities. We have several different lanes in which we work for disability, but our annual event and focus and convening of individuals is to talk about employing people with disabilities around the world, wanting to benchmark where we stood as a global community in trying to help people with disabilities to find work, and really kind of changing the way we approached it. For many times we see what's called internationally as disabled persons organizations, DPOs, and families approaching the business community and saying, you know, it's the right thing to do. It's, you know, the moral or ethical thing, or, you know, you should do it because, it means something, and can only get so far getting jobs presented that way. And so we thought we would take an approach of doing 2 things. One is to bring a broad group of people together, corporations, micro enterprises, governments, NGOs, academics, and funders. And 2, try to push the business community to tell the story. So find individual businesses, whether they be corporations or small businesses, to tell the story about why they hire people with disabilities, or why it's important to them to diversify their staff. And specifically, as they talk about diversity and inclusion, why disability is such a major part of that. And it's because we wanted to push both the idea that those businesses have a stake in this and that they should be telling their story, but also because it pushes other businesses to competition. And so we saw that as a way of being able to raise the stakes a bit and get folks talking at a different level. You can hear from me as an advocate all day long, telling you about why you should hire people with disabilities, but you hear the CEO of a company that's, your competitor or in the same region as you saying why they did it, then that then raises an eyebrow, and that brings them to question why they are not doing it. And so we've been doing that now for 6 years. We will have our next summit coming up in June, like I said. And we've been able to broaden those conversations and to be more inclusive of different businesses that we had not started off with as partners, to really share what they've done, to share success stories, to share failure stories, to give ideas on good practices for how they've approached certain things, but then also let those stories be told of the people, individuals with disabilities themselves, who have gone through their processes at different companies, or who become entrepreneurs themselves after working for a short time period for some of these companies. So with that, I will take a breath and a pause and take questions, and we can just discuss if you like. Or did I bore you all?
I always love that review of the disability policy, Joseph, and kind of where things started and where they've come. I think it's a good reminder of how much work we still have yet to do. And I think, again, if folks haven't yet had a chance to look at that DOJ report, I hate to sound like a broken record or a dog with a bone, but I just think it's really important. And it aligns with a lot of the things that Dr. Jones was talking to us about today. And even just this, I think it might sound cliche, but this idea of understanding where we've come from and kind of where we've been and how it impacts where we are today. So they can be more intentional with how we move forward. I'm going to grab that document for you and hopefully share that. Let me try to share that with the group. Is there any questions or comments? See what's going on here in the chat. Question, what trends do you see in reverting back to the medical model? Are you seeing any trends with that? Maybe both here and abroad?
Well, definitely abroad. There's a lot of folks who have kind of the idea of fixing. One case in point, there's essentially a work camp in China that is trying to address folks on the autism spectrum, and they believe that it's a symptom of laziness, essentially. And so they are trying to re-educate them and motivate them by moving rocks across courtyards and going on long hikes and runs and those types of things. And so that's kind of disappointing. There was another place that had many of their folks very focused. So they said, if you were to go to higher education and you are deaf, then you can only study these 2 or 3 things. If you are blind, then you can only study these 2 or 3 things. So those are your options if you want to go to college. So both a combination of their ableist viewpoint, but also their medical model. This is where we can hone your skill to do this thing and fix you. The other thing I would say for our country in reverting is much of how we addressed the pandemic early on, particularly in how we thought about I would say the upside has been great. The upside with the access to telehealth and all the technology and being able to have flexible work schedules and all of those things have worked much better for people with disabilities who've been asking for those things for years. And all of a sudden they could have accommodations, and that's been great. The downside has been kind of how we've looked at comorbidity, a lot of ways of more challenges that have hit people with disabilities while they've been home. During this, general health care being shut down for one of those things, and where those services are already backlogged. So that's been a little bit problematic because it's as if, well, you're already sick anyway, or you're already have a disability, so we're going to focus on these individuals. And so kind of the rationing of care, there was a lot of great articles written about that horrible practice during 2020, especially mid to late 2020, when that was seemingly happening quite a bit. So those are some of the things I've seen.
Thank you. Sorry, there's a lot going on here in the chat. Some we can see and some you can't. So thank you for that. Is there ways for individuals who are interested in the work of the Harkin Institute to get more involved?
Sure. So you can sign up for information on our website, which is harkininstitute.org. All of you as individuals who are deeply into the field can reach out to us directly for conversation, or if you have questions, or if you want to share information. Our director of disability policy is Daniel Van Zant, and I can put his email in the chat for anybody who wants it, but he's your main guy when it comes to all things disability and the Harkin Institute. And we will always welcome having folks kind of be a part of our network. We are always looking for partners and sometimes looking for research fellows and other folks to work on projects that are relating to our work. So we know we can't do it all, and we definitely don't have all of the expertise. So it's always helpful to have others who want to join in the fight and be a part of what we're doing.
Can you speak a little bit to any of the work that might be happening at the state level to create change in our public universities and community colleges in the realm of disability services?
I can't. I was actually just with some folks who were looking at Department of Ed policies and jobs just earlier this week, yesterday, and it is a much more growing concern than I had previously realized. Oftentimes, many places that have disability services on a higher ed campus are there part-time, or definitely not there all year round. And so that speaks a little bit to how much emphasis is there. We definitely notice that the physical barriers on a college campus are still pretty high. They're all afterthoughts for the most part in terms of retrofitting and even how they accommodate students. I don't know if anyone's doing any concentrated effort to address that or bringing that to better changes. But if anybody does have any insights on that, I'd be happy to have it. Daniel's background is in special ed and education law when it comes to disability, so he might have a little bit better sense or finger on the pulse of what's happening there, but I do not.
No worries. I think, well, I don't know if you, Misty, if you want to talk about that at all. I don't know if you have anything, that you would like to add to that. Otherwise, let's see. Do we know of any places? Oh, go ahead. Sorry, did I interrupt you? No? Okay. Do we know of any places where they're doing better with pay for direct support professionals who are working with people with disabilities, where their work maybe seems to be more valued and or respected? Gosh.
No, but I do have a community of folks that I visit with once a month, kind of about what's happening across the country in certain things, and that's a question that I would love to bring up to them, just because I think that there's probably an answer, or at least some thoughts of who's doing good work or trying to do good work. So, Jess, if you can send me that question, or
Yes.
I can inquire about that on Friday.
You bet. Okay. And that question came from Mari Reynolds with them.
Okay.
You might know Mari, but I will share that with you. Where's contact info? Perfect. Any additional questions or comments?
Was this helpful at all to you?
Immensely.
This is Doug. It was a good refresher to go over it again. It was, but we still have a long ways to go. We have a lack of community resource providers at the moment, and I'm really struggling with my job candidates fitting employers not being willing to job carve and not being willing to, and I think it's their loss. And I told them some today, I think it's your loss. I think you're turning down a really good job candidate because you're not willing to look at things differently. So I think we've come a long ways. I used accommodations in school. I was in the disability office. I know all about all of that. I still think we have a long ways to go to make employers understand what good job candidates we have and how to break down a job so it's doable.
I agree with you, Doug. I think that there's a lot of let's just call them lazy employers or recruiters who, they're very used to their cookie cutter way of doing things and what their process is, and the idea that you would disrupt how they would do something, or they would have to take extra time to work through something is hard for them. And I think one of the things that we've seen through our summits has been working with some of those HR professionals who have realized that they need as many people in their workforce as they can possibly get. That means they need to search all corners, but they also needed to be able to change their approach. They could not expect people to fit into their paradigm anymore. They needed to go out and they needed to seek differently. I can give a good example of this. We have a good friend we work with at Penn State who has designed several courses for her graduate and undergraduate students in HR that focus specifically on disability. And so the idea being that she's taking these pre-professional HR professionals and they're ingraining disability into their work. So when they get to the job, it's not even a question that disability is a part of their workforce net that they're casting. And she's taking those graduate students who have been in the workforce for a few years and bringing them in and saying, hey, you know what, you could probably do a better job for your business or organization and also stand out as an HR professional if you then start to really move on keeping disability as a part of your hiring practice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just going to share some additional comments. Just thanking you for the contact for Daniel, and Jenny will reach out. She most recently did some work in higher education and disability services, and there's a lot going on, she says, the universities that should be of concern or that need some work. So
Sure.
I think that's great. Thanks, Jenny. That's wonderful. Yes, thank yous. And it was helpful, relevant, particularly for somebody who's been new to the field. So really helpful there. A gentle reminder, I totally forgot about this, about the work of the National Association of Direct Support Professionals, right? It's doing work to elevate the role of the DSP and professionalize. I know that I can just say that I know Florida's done some pretty significant and focused work on that, on identifying appropriate training for direct support professionals and kind of mapping out all those core competencies right across all those that have been developed and piloting some training platforms for some of their direct support professionals. I know the youth set here is doing a lot of work too, or is looking to do some work around right, a learning management system and kind of a larger training system to support direct support professionals and unemployment professionals here in the state. So that there's a lot of work going on. Let's see, very helpful, thank you. Okay, just a lot of thank you. So I think I got our comments caught up there and our questions, responses. I did want to mention to the group that I know that IME has a workforce shortage work group right now that's cross-agency and collaborative, right? And I think Leanne Moskowitz is always looking to widen that group or broaden that group, if you will. So if you don't know about that, or you feel like maybe your perspective might not be represented, or you would like to be represented on there, maybe just reach out to IC, or if you communicate directly with Leanne Moskowitz, I think reaching out to her and letting her know your interest in something like that as it relates to the workforce shortage. I think she would love to have you. I don't know if I'm forgetting something. Any other questions, comments?
If I could take a second, my name is Brandy Tenholzen and I work at Western Iowa Tech Community College. And you guys had talked about higher education and some of the concerns and stuff. And I just wanted to relay to you that we're in Sioux City and they have changed our our disabilities coordinator. They've changed her position to accommodation specialist to get rid of some of that stigma of students that are working with her. And I wanted to say that we've done a whole lot on our campus. We have a giant testing center that they can go to take their tests, to have a quiet atmosphere. And I've been told it's one of the best ones that our accommodations person has seen at any of the other schools, as well as they have cursory readers that anyone can use. You don't even have to have the accommodations in your IEP for it. So I know they're taking a lot of steps to try and help our students. We even added a counselor that they can talk to for anxiety or any issues that they have one for employees, as well as another person for students that you can go see free at any time. And so I think they've added a lot, at least on our campus that I know of. So I just wanted to speak to that.
That's great.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
One of the first
Brandon.
things we had to do when we got here was our school didn't have an accessibility map, so we had to create one of those for campus. That was one of our first student projects that we had our undergraduates do.
Well, and Mari shared in the chat, a reminder to us, that helping schools and families do good transition planning for students leaving high school can also make a big difference. And shared the Transition Iowa website again, that is just a bevy of tools and resources and information related to transition. Thank you, Mari. Brandy, if you don't mind, would you mind sharing your email in the chat there if folks are interested in kind of reaching out to you and learning more about what you all been doing up in Sioux City? Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome. I'm actually an intermediary, so I work with high school students on voc rehab, getting them ready for transition after high school. But I will put my information in there for you guys.
Perfect.
Thank
Yes. You. The intermediary network's a great resource for sure, right? And underutilized and maybe a little, I know. So thank you. As we wait here to see if there's any additional questions, comments, reactions, I will share the evaluation link again. We always love your feedback. Let us know if today was helpful and relevant and some of your takeaways. We always appreciate that. Any recommendations for future webinars, both logistically and topic-wise, always open to those as well. We come back February 15th from 1 to 2 p.m. And we're going to be hosting Isaac Carter with the coaching imperative. Isaac is amazing. I'm really excited to have him. He's a part of our team at Griffin-Hammis, and he's going to talk to us that day about understanding bias and utilizing our emotional intelligence to understand differences. And it's some really powerful stuff with some really great discussion and tools that I think you'll find really helpful. Not just in your day-to-day work, but probably in your life, in your home and with your families and friends and stuff like that. So if you can make it in February on the 15th from 1 to 2, I think you'll really value that discussion. Check that comments there real quick, and I'll probably, wonderful. Thank you, Brandy, for sharing your contact information. Okay, well, I think, it's 1:54, and Dr. Jones, thank you so much for your time and discussion today. Super helpful, super relevant, and a lot of takeaways for me at least, and I think the group as well. So again, thanks for coming. Yeah, thanks for coming, and thank you everybody for joining us today, and we hope to see you in February. I'll be sure to get the recording and materials out, as well as your registration link for February. So take care and have a great rest of the week.
Thanks, Jess.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.